Yeah, that was a lot to take in from both of you. But I saw. I'm just going to start the conversation, and then we'll get questions from the audience. But I saw a lot of parallels in both your approaches, and and Jim's work, looking at, for example, in the Microsoft campus, looking at the story of the whole specific context, all the way from the bay, the tidal flats, the tidal marshes, to the oak groves, and looking at that, looking at what the past did to to changing that landscape, and looking at how you can revive that landscape, getting water to go down and revive the issues there. And you, with that example of the STP to the wetlands, and then clearing that water and reusing that water. So there's clearly a lot of in the very urban examples that Jim gave, and in the more peri-urban examples that you have been working with, as well as, of course, with the groundwater. But so there is that parallel happening here. I'd like to start with the questions that Jim, and that's probably, I'll direct that at you, Vishwanath, that Jim raised at the end of his presentation, which were what are the impacts that we are feeling because of climate change in our country? What are the strategies that we are using, and through your practice, can we just start that conversation?
Well, already spoke quite enough, I think, for one night and threw it at it. But let me tell you, in India, climate change will first manifest itself with water. We will face urban flooding, we'll face unseasonal rain, we'll face droughts together, right? So the climate crisis, for a vast majority of our farmers, is a water crisis. And how do we deal with it is our challenge. And so one of the ways we can deal with it, and we can't deal with all parts of it. Let's remember that 65% of our farming or agriculture is rain-fed, right? So the unseasonality of rains, thanks to the climate crisis, is a major challenge for us. The only way we can try and make it a bit of resilience is to bring the aquifer into play. So therefore, to understand the aquifer and make sure that we harvest every drop, we recharge it, and we use it wisely. We can't use it indiscriminately with free power, right? So both in the rural areas and in urban areas, I think water will be the first is already the first manifestation of climate change, and we'll have to find solutions quickly, as some of these solutions were, but we'll have to find more solutions.
Jim, California has been facing a drought, but the water seems to still run in the taps. There is no visual or scene crisis that you face. Maybe you can't wash your car, you can't water your lawns. Have you been facing what kind of, you showed that in some of your projects, but have you all specifically been looking at drought and that crisis in some of your work?
Yes, absolutely. I think we've all gotten more skilled, more scientific about the use of water, the planting of drought-tolerant species. The example of Microsoft to take a corporate landscape and have a zero irrigation goal is a big step forward. I think certainly for our practice, but I think arguably for the industry as well. But those kinds of solutions are now becoming more common. We have to. There's a whole palette of native plants in the form of existing ecologies that we can learn from, that are adapted to the cycles of drought and wet. And all we have to do is look to nature and start to follow those cues of how to create those landscapes artificially. So definitely there's more awareness in California, throughout the American West, really, of drought-tolerant landscapes. You see in the desert American West landscapes that are completely about cacti and succulents and gravel ground cover. So that change is happening, and it's, it has the potential to make a significant difference in water use.
Do you all also do a lot of digging and removing groundwater like we do in India with bore wells? Is that also a source of water that that the U.S. relies on?
It is, and it's problematic. We were talking earlier today about the problem we have in the Central Valley, which is the agricultural belt that runs through the center of the state. It's a big north-south valley that is contained by the coastal range on the west and then the Sierra Nevada range on the east. And the main source of agricultural water in that valley is through wells. And the aquifer is being drawn down now to a dangerous level, to the point where the land is subsiding. So portions of the Central Valley are now sinking because the groundwater is no longer there to support the land. Fields are going fallow. We have our big water supply in California is the snowpack of the Sierra Nevada, and that's diminishing now. Each year we're getting a little bit less snowpack, therefore the snow melt is not down and filling the lakes in the spring, and then those lakes, which are used for municipal water, but they're also used for agriculture, they're also used for just natural streams and what's referred to as recreational waters, but it's really habitat for fisheries. So there's this three-way competition in California for water between agriculture, urbanized areas, and nature and fisheries. And it's a battle. There are all-out political fights right now all over California fighting for this diminishing water supply. So we're definitely at a critical level. Agriculture may be displaced. It may simply move away to other regions. The Central Valley and much of Southern California was a desert to begin with. It's only through artificial irrigation that we've created cities and farmland. So, the pendulum may have to swing back, maybe not fully, but it may have to swing back to a certain level. Can I just make an additional reflection? And I think based on some of the other things that have been discussed, I think the way that we're thinking about cities more and more as, this sponge cities is a term that's being used a lot in the industry. It's not coming from me, but literally to make our cities more spongy, more absorbent of water, to be able to catch water, slow water, absorb water, filter water in the urban landscape. I think that's the real challenge and the opportunity ahead. It's an opportunity because it's tremendous potential for greening and to create cities that are, more human places, more comfortable places, more climatically comfortable with more developed urban canopies, but also bringing green to the ground plane. So that interweaving of greenery with the urban landscape is something that has a whole range of benefits for resilience, things that you're talking about very eloquently in your presentation about how can we reabsorb water back into our water table. That can happen in urban areas. We just have to create the pervious zones that allow us to do that. And I think, one of the things that happens is that people tend to think about the big solutions for doing that. You know, the giant retention basin or the riverfront and redeveloping the floodplain areas for the riverfront. But I think there's much more capacity to integrate those systems into the city in a broad, far-reaching network that spreads throughout the city. You know, the big moves are only going to account for a very small portion of the need. But if we can institute networks through the city using streets, using, you know, our park systems, but mainly streets, retooling our streets so that they are incorporating stormwater management zones and these absorptive strips, there's actually a lot we can do. And, you know, if you add to that the absorbing abilities of private properties and roofs and things like that, you really start to develop a robust network that can provide all of these functions. So, you know, I think the other fallacy in a lot of the conversations is that we will be able to solve problems of flooding somehow within the channel, right, within the river channel, where a big part of the solution for flooding, again, happens in this distributed network that's throughout the watershed. You know, it's in the streets, it's in the properties, it's throughout the city. So it's just a different mentality of how we think about cities and its ability to absorb water and slow water.
Vishwanath mentioned that it's time to look at urban planning laws, urban design laws, building codes that look at what's happening under the ground, that looks at aquifer, that looks at water, groundwater. Jim, this is back at you, but is there any such thing in the building code in the city or in California where you have to look at what's happening below you before you can build a triple basement?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
I mean, maybe in some other cities that I'm not aware of, but I've not heard of that in California.
Okay, so this is my last question, and then we'll open it out. Both of you mentioned, and I know working with Jim, how much collaboration happens in the US, and working with right from parking specialists, transportation specialists, hydrology, geology, urban designers, architects, landscape architects, planners. And you mentioned that it was the last point you mentioned today. So my point to you, question to both of you is, in your work, Vishwanath, where do you start with that? And what have you been doing to bring all these people together? You brought them together in a more informal way. Jim brings them together in a more formal way. I'd like both of you to talk about how you'll bring these people together and what you do, and how, for example, how can the more formal practices like architects, urban designers, I find that in our, at least I'm taking the liberty to speak for some of us, is that we tend to work in very individual ways. We seem to think that we can have most of the answers ourselves, and we try to use our minds rather than actually having serious collaborations. And I'd like Prasanna also to add in on that, but yeah, that's my question.
Well, we need to create institutions or groups which work at multidisciplinarity. The architect or the urban designer is busy in his or her practice, and there's very little slack time, right, given the nature of the industry there. So I think we need to create institutions which are able to talk to all of them. Like, for example, in a small way, Biome Trust is what it is because it does not have a single discipline in it. Or everybody's there, an agriculturist, a communication specialist, everybody's there. And they're there because there's a passion for what they're doing, right? And then you have to spend a lot of time on the field And you have to have the ability to learn from the field. It's not just to go to the field, but to also dialogue, converse, and learn from it. And put in a matrix of understanding which is deeper than just mere data collection or data understanding, right? And then you have to bring it, and then you've been able to have the gift of the gab or the power of PowerPoint to be able to convince decision makers about it also. And you have to convey a sense of excitement and convey a sense of ownership, right? That, hey, look, this is what's happening in your constituency. So when we talk to our MLA first, he didn't even know what was happening in his constituency when we got the Jakkur Lake going. But when he saw it and he saw that there was a brownie point to get from that, he got all the lakes in the constituency with wetlands and wastewater systems. And then he was the one who became Minister for Agriculture, and he pushed for this transfer of treated wastewater into larger scales. So serendipity plays a crucial role in it. However, serendipity can be incubated if you have more and more conversations and narratives. And let me tell you that it's great fun.
And conversations and narratives with exactly who?
With everybody. You know, you got to talk to the fisherman, you got to talk to the well digger. So here's how stories begin, right? I'm sitting on my dirt track racing bike, going for a dirt track racing. Somebody taps me on the shoulder and says, do you want a well dug? Till the time I didn't know that there existed a tribe of people who were digging wells for a living, right? But then you have to have the thinking to say, oh, come, let's have a conversation and let's listen to what your story is, right? So we must have the patience to listen to everybody, right? So as many people as possible, and then to make meaning out of it. And then the decision maker, you have to find a seat at the table. It's no use throwing stones at the caravan. You have to become part of that caravan. So you have to inveigle yourself into policy spaces, into decision-making spaces, into project spaces, into institutions. And you can't be a rebel at those places. You have to be part rebel, but part compromiser also, therefore to convince. So there are spaces like this for institutions and individuals, and that's the great new future for India. For the youngsters especially. All us gray-haired fellows are all gone. But for the youngsters, I mean, there's tremendously lot to do with conversations and learnings from different disciplines. Sorry.
So maybe a couple of reflections. One thing that keeps coming up again and again on my sabbatical project is the knowledge that exists in our heritage about how to address these issues that we have. And we're sort of this society that has ignored that ancient knowledge and just marched ahead on our paths to progress, and now we're in deep trouble. And in Australia, this really came through strongly. They, in Australia, are really starting to recognize the value of the First Nation people, the Aborigines, and their knowledge of living in balance with the land. And now we're saying, oh, geez, we need to do that too. And we're realizing now, a little bit too late. And so what can those ancient traditions tell us if we study them and understand them? And I think it's coming across very strongly in all of my conversations here in India. And you talked about this ancient tradition of well digging, people that understand what the groundwater is doing, what the seasons are doing. So there's this wealth of knowledge in our heritage, and we have that in America, but we have not embraced that knowledge of the Native Americans, and we're just starting to get a certain awareness that they have, this wealth of knowledge and can really be part of the solutions that we're looking for. Canada, I think, is a little farther ahead in this regard. The U.S. is behind, but India, it seems to me, has just such an amazing depth and wealth of knowledge in the heritage. So I just wanted to make that comment. And then as far as collaboration, I think, something that is maybe taken shape for me in the last decade or so of my practice is that I think all of us need to be good generalists where we back away and have a collaborative conversation, understanding all of the complexity of a problem, and formulate strategies that are based on that interdisciplinary conversation. And then we can all have the ability to drill in and to apply whatever each of our individual craft is. And, mine is landscape architecture, but I'm also often in a leadership position on a larger scale planning or urban design effort where I'm having those more general conversations that are involving all of these disciplines. So being able to back away from your individual discipline and understand that complexity with all of those, that expertise for those larger problem solving, and then being able to zero in and, install the well or install a native landscape, I think is sort of the power each of us have, whether we're an architect or an engineer or an ecologist. So I wanted to make that comment as well. And the last comment I wanted to make is that we have realized, maybe more so in the last decade or so, how much we don't know as our individual disciplines. That landscape architects, I can speak for maybe more than just making a generalized statement, but I think we've been guilty of thinking we can sort of do it all. It's like, how hard can ecology really be? You're just sticking native species in the ground. And I think we've really taken the science to heart now and are engaging experts. We're realizing we're not the experts. There's really so little we know about the inner workings of ecology, and that really takes those scientists being on our team to understand that. And the same with soils. We're realizing the great importance of soils to ecological health and landscape health, and to be able to bring the soil scientists on board and then have a plan for the entire underground networks that are supporting our landscape. And that plan is just as important to design and to implement and to have the right approach to creating that soil zone as everything we do above ground. So soil scientists, biologists, ecologists, we're really trying to integrate those specialties on our teams, more and more.
I think that's also a reflection of the budgets, the fee budgets that these projects have, whether it's from a government mandate, it's a government project, or it's a private project. I think that's a respectful thing. That's the right thing, because sometimes it just comes down to economics, that we just don't have the fee to engage with so many different consultants. So then we try to do it all as much as we can, just from a simple financial. But that's maybe a discussion for another day.
Maybe.
But you can reflect on it.
Well, I think one thing I wanted to note is I think that the big projects that do attract the big fees have traditionally been of a certain profile. Maybe it's a big transit project, or it's a big, stadium project or something like that. I think we are starting to get into an era where the big projects can be a green infrastructure project, because there is an increasing understanding that those big green infrastructure moves need to be part of solving some of our most difficult, flood issues and other things of that nature. And so these big civic projects are starting to lean, this pendulum is starting to swing over to projects that have a heavy component of green infrastructure and has the budget to go along with it, which can then, allow us to bring in the sciences that are needed to do those projects properly.
Kushru, I have a question on this.
Of course, now we'll open it out.
Jim, you mentioned, since we are on this subject of budgeting, and Kushru just asked a question about fees. I'm not particularly concerned about the fees per se, but when you talked about a project where it was made mandatory for the community to come up with housing, and then you said that you were given targets for 600 houses here and some 1,000 houses here. And the authorities also said that they would do it if you don't do it as a community initiative. Where does the funding come from? You didn't speak much about the funding part of the housing issue.
The funding of the building of housing itself, or the funding to
The funding
plan
of the
it?
building of the housing
The
itself.
building to the housing. Well, those are still developer projects. So the job of the city is to regulate it. So the plans we're creating are regulating plans. They're called specific plans. They're like district plans that show, where housing can go, the scale and the FAR that's allowable in different areas, some architectural standards and guidelines that would be applied to that. And then once the city codifies that as the regulating plan, then it's open season for developers to come in. And developers then and landowners can come in, and they would then finance projects in their traditional ways. And the reason they are incentivized to do that is because these regulating plans mostly are allowing much higher densities now, and that makes it a worthwhile project for
Is it making the problem worse by densification?
The problem of what?
Of construction, urban areas particularly, urbanization.
Is densification making the construction cost problem worse?
I think probably it will be affecting the ecology more severely, more...
The ecology. Okay. Well, I think that the way I think about that, and I think, maybe is a shared view in my market area around the Bay Area, is that, traditionally in the Bay Area, we've been pretty good about the preservation of open space. So there is sort of a protected zone outside of most cities where no additional sprawl is allowed. Not everywhere. That's still a problem in certain areas. There's still sort of uncontrolled sprawl that's happening in certain communities, and it's also happening in the Central Valley with the farmland. But by and large, the Bay Area as a region has done pretty good at open space preservation and doing a urban growth limit line, past which no further growth can happen. The densification, in theory, is working within the existing urbanized footprint. Okay, areas that have already been disturbed, but also areas where transit exists, and it's leveraging that transit. So if you're going to put growth, if the Bay Area is growing, and that's just reality, then where is that growth best placed? And I think what the trend we're seeing is that growth is best placed within the existing footprint, near transit, and then densification is feasible in those areas. Because you're sort of leveraging the transit and you're making communities that are more walkable, you're reducing the need for automobile. If that growth is allowed to continue to spread horizontally, that's when we run into additional problems of ecological impact, but also just more creation of greenhouse gases, because we're just encouraging more driving and et cetera. So that's how I would look at that.
One off-track question just before I hand over. What does WRT stand for?
Wallace, Roberts, and Todd. And so Ian McCarg started the firm with 3 of his grad students from University of Pennsylvania, and those are the 3 names. So it used to be called Wallace, McCarg, Roberts, and Todd. And then when McHarg left the firm after 15 or 20 years starting it, then it became WRT, which is the three remaining founders of the firm. No, they've all retired. Yeah, we're like in our third generation now of leadership. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rahul, a practicing architect from Pune. Nice presentations by both of you. I have two questions to both of you. The first is, in some of the industrial parks or projects where the land parcels are pretty large, there is an observation that there is no bylaw which specifies, maintaining the course of water and how water goes to existing reservoirs. And as a result of that, when it is not followed, it is found that a lot of flooding happens in these sites, as well as it overspills to the neighborhood area, and as a result of which a lot of water is wasted. So is there something being done at a policy level? Obviously in India, I'd like to know from Vishwanath and from you, James, in the United States, to ensure that that is followed, because there is a micro to macro effect of this when you look at a city. The second question, I'll just complete the questions, is some of the issues you spoke about. If you look at, I won't use the word sustainability, but the green principles, whether you're doing a planning project or a campus level project. I've, in my observation, find that a lot of these issues are not spoken about in academia to the level they should be. The green agenda starts coming as a layer, not as an intrinsic, holistic approach from day one. So is there, because now I don't think that I'm in my 50s, in the next 10 years it's going to be an optional thing. It is got to be a compulsory thing from here on. So what in your view should academia also do to bring this as and mandate this? Because sensitization at the academic level, I think, also is a need of the hour to have a propagated thinking in this zone.
Yeah, so, sure. For the first, our city went through a massive flood issue, and we discovered that our CDP or our master plan does not recognize water pathways at all, as you rightly pointed out. So we're now digging up maps from 1904, revenue maps, and trying to use JCBs to demolish buildings to figure out where water goes. But as you know, that urban areas are faced with two major challenges. One is the urban heat island effect, means that higher intensity of rainfall. And because it's all paved now and hardscaped, the runoff coefficient is also higher by 4 or 5, right? So you have a double whammy. So those old ancient drainages will tell you what a pathway could be, but then you have to design a modern stormwater drain to be able to manage it better, including retention, detention, and holding on to water. I think we are sadly lacking in it, including the transit-oriented development, which is now the flavor of planning all across India. Linear infrastructures like roads, flyovers, metros ignore water, both the hydrological movement of water, hydrological storage of water, as well as hydrogeological movement of water. We'll have to now start to recognize water as an essential component of design, predict what the pathways are, protect those pathways and those reservoirs which are there, and design around them. So structure plans will have to be developed, integrated into master plans, geotagged, and then put in public domain to say, look, this is the water infrastructure which needs to be protected. There's a setback or a buffer zone, as it is called, and then we need to respect those buffer zones. Otherwise, we work very arbitrarily. And as you rightly pointed out, industrial zones are absolutely neglectful of this. So we need to figure a solution quickly for that. I just want to respond very quickly to the green architecture thing. I think it's not only in architecture, but in every discipline that we need to put environment and ecology at the heart of it. We ran a new education policy now. Hopefully, it will recognize this as a foundational principle on which we build it. Because what we did in school curriculum was we took out environment. which was mandated by the Supreme Court, that's been taken out. Even that little bit which was being taught about environmental education is now gone. So I think the climate crisis deserves more respect, otherwise we'll face the consequences.
I agree with everything he said. The only thing I would add is in California, we do, and I think most states in the U.S., there are stormwater regulations now that you can't have any net increase in runoff from your site that you develop. So that's pretty tightly controlled, and I think working pretty well. I think the domain of opportunity now is in older sites that that didn't have those regulations as tight. That there's still a lot of impervious areas. So redeveloping those, and then when they redevelop, they will have to adhere to new regulations, but also public corridors. We have these wide commercial streets, throughout America now that were built back in the 50s and 60s that are just, there's too much pavement. We don't need all that pavement. So I think there's a huge domain there of potential improvement if we can start to to retool all those corridors. And then what I would say about education is I think that education is getting on board. So maybe you're seeing some specific instances where you're not seeing that happening. I would raise your voice with those institutions, because I think a lot of institutions definitely are getting on board with the green agenda, and placing that, as you say, front and center. I think that is where it needs to be. I think we think of a project in conceptual development as first starting with the regulating framework of that project, and that framework has to have a number of sort of important performative layers to it. And one of them is the hydrology layer, another is sort of the green layer, another is the mobility layer. And once all of those layers are giving proper weight, that framework can be established, and then the development can happen framed by all of those functions which are firmly in place. And I think that framework needs to be heavily weighted towards the green agenda aspects. And those can still be wonderfully form-giving. I think that we shouldn't see this, that that all of the beautiful city making, the sort of the formal city making tools that we've had traditionally, in the Beaux-Arts tradition, we're going to lose that all and create this sort of, amorphous, sort of ill-defined realm. I don't think that's true. I think there is a new aesthetic that is emerging, but I think it can be just as form-giving and just as beautiful as the classic cities. So, but I do think that the green agenda, needs to be a heavy influence on that.
Do you want to reflect something on the second question on academia? Or?
Well, just that I think the schools are getting on board. I see that strongly in the programs that we're still associated with, and we participate in juries and discussions, and we also recruit from those programs. And I think they're on board with the agenda, and they're preparing the students pretty well. So I think if you see pockets of where that's not front and center, that would be a good opportunity to collaborate with those programs, and maybe ask them to up their game a little bit.
Hello, I'm Azhar. I'm an urban planner and a social anthropologist here in Pune. Fascinating presentations, thank you both. I'd like to direct my question to Mr. Vishwanath in particular, but the issue I think is something that might interest you as well, Jim. The question I have for you, Mr. Vishwanath, is, thank you for mapping out the networks of collaboration in Bangalore around these very successful micro projects and larger projects, but the elephant in the room that you haven't actually spoken to is every planner's bugbear in India. And that is how to get these projects to live out and transcend the life cycle of the IAS officer. The question is, if all projects that a planner does are subservient to or answerable to the politician's tenure and the IAS officer's tenure every time, and the planner has to repeat the same message every time somebody, a new elected official comes on the scene. How has Bangalore ensured that these projects have survived multiple tenures? Or is this still a challenge that you see unfolding in Bangalore, and what sort of solutions would you offer?
You asked a very important question, and there's no easy answer for that. And and all of us know here that the bureaucrat Babu is the decision maker. In the case of the transfer of treated wastewater, the political leadership had to ram it down the throats of the bureaucrats and get the project going. The bureaucrats were the most reluctant. It was political leadership which actually got it going, right? Now it's embedded itself with the farmers so much that no bureaucrat can put a stop to it. There's so much pent-up demand for that water that if you don't get that wastewater, the farmers will be up in arms. No politician can allow that to happen, and therefore there's a bureaucratic struggle. With the Jakut Lake project also, it's the same. The community now and the fishermen now are such prominent voices in the city and in the media that there's nobody who can put paid to it, right? So even if there's a fish kill, there's an uproar and they want to fix it. It's a tough and tricky job. A lot of cases the bureaucrats go and the project dies. We'll have to start to figure out creative ways because we know what the problem is. Now it's up to us to figure out what the creative solution is. And it's not an easy one. And just as a response to the previous question about education, you know how much of common sense is missing nowadays in our world is, let's name it as one of the leading institutions of India, premier institution, head of the department, a professor in that institution, puts a basement in his house. The basement gets water. So he puts concrete in the basement. And pretty soon he's put enough concrete that even a dwarf can't step in, right? It's now only 4 feet. And it crystal clear water that you can't put a well and start using the water, lower the aquifer so that your basement is put to use and the well water can be put to use. So somewhere along the line with our specialization in education, we've even lost common sense. And that's even more dangerous than an education in a particular profession, right? So how do we get back basic understanding of soil, water, how water behaves, how soil behaves, how groundwater behaves, how rainfall behaves? How do we get that also back into consideration before we persuade the bureaucrat also is the challenge before us as a society.
Hi, my name is Maitreya. I'm an environmental lawyer, and thank you both for such enlightening presentations. I have a slightly basic question. It's it's something that I'm not entirely clear on, and I'm hoping you guys can enlighten me a bit on that. Is that from where I sit, I don't really understand what we mean by urbanization, other than the fact that there are a few essential components, mainly centralization and creation of infrastructure. Other than that, I'm not really sure what we mean by when we say we want to carry on the process of urbanization or further urbanization. And both of those things, in as from how I see it, aren't particularly great. Centralization, of course, has its own set of problems. Creation of infrastructure is tremendously resource intensive. Of course, we can try to offset the damage by creating, green infrastructure. But correct me if I'm wrong. The net is always you will be sort of putting in more resources than you are saving. The carbon footprint would perhaps be significant, even if you are able to mitigate the damage, simply because the materials that you use, the kind of minerals, the kind of inputs that are required itself are have water costs embedded to them, have like different kind of ecological imprints. So my question is that if what are the sort of components of urbanization, and if what I have highlighted is sort of the whole and soul of it, then is urbanization even such a great thing? Should we keep aspiring to it? Because Vishwanath ji mentioned that it's key that we identify the problem before we think of potential solutions. So is our race to create more urban city centers, is that itself the problem, and is perhaps going back to the village model a more sustainable alternative? Both of you, I guess.
So this is the essential battle between Gandhiji and Ambedkar, right? At that particular philosophical debate. I think 75 years on, October 2nd being close by, I think the relentless nature of capitalism and the market is to urbanize. There is no nation which has not urbanized to 80-85% once it has followed this economic model. And there are no alternative economic models, unfortunately, right? So therefore, do we go and understand with the flow and try to make our urban areas more livable or not is a choice before us. It's not, in my opinion, in terms of energy, a choice between ruralization or urbanization. The great attempt at ruralization was Cambodia. And the consequences of that Cambodian experiment is for us to read. The question is, can we be more receiving of our urban areas for migrants who come in? Can we be more welcoming? Can our cities be more livable? That's something that I think we have in our control. One of the attempts at and to define urbanization, it's 75% of the people are engaged in non-agricultural activity and a density of population which is 40,000 per square kilometer or more. So that's a basic definition that we work on, or administratively defined as an urban area. That's the definition of it. So the question is, when aspirationally it's a relentless choice of people to come, my city now does not attract people from Karnataka, it attracts people from Northeast, from Bihar, from UP. Should we be welcoming or not? In my opinion, we should be welcoming. We should accept that as a reality and we should make their life livable, right? Is it suboptimal? Yes, it's suboptimal. Do we have to live with it? Yes, we have to live with it. Now, how can we imagine our cities to be less carbon intensive, more circular in economy, do things in polynodal fashion where there are neighborhoods of 100,000 people which are self-contained? Or do we follow Charles Correa and his National Commission on Urbanization report given in the 80s, which was such a far-sighted vision where we distribute urbanization spatially and economically and make sure that regional balance for urbanization is there? These are things that we can revisit. But the very same Bangalore provides 60% of the GDP of the state. That one city provides monies for public health infrastructure, for schooling, for roads, you name it, all kinds of social infrastructure. It happens because Mumbai or Bangalore earns those kind of monies, right? So it's been a tragedy of our times that we've seen urbanization in a very negative lens. I think realistically, you and me will have to say what can we do best with this beast that we have unleashed and that genie which cannot go into the bottle back again. And so when people ask me, what is the population limit for Bangalore? A lot of people want caps on the population of the city. Can you achieve a cap on a population of the city in a democratic setup? Can we do that? Can we not think of 30 million people in the city but still a livable city? That's the way to look at it. And I think it's possible. But I can go on this. Sorry.
I agree with everything he said. But I would add, I think cities are growing. So I don't think we as city growers are growing the cities. I think the cities are growing. And we are responding to that by trying to guide that growth towards a resilient end state. And I think our cities to date have not been growing towards a resilient end state. I think they are sort of the most fossil fuel efficient way of accommodating accommodating a population by concentrating it, but I think we could do so much better in the carbon footprint of our cities. So I think that's our challenge, is that we, the cities are growing just because of economic trends, the rural to urban migration that's happening, climate migration. People are on the move and they're moving to cities. And so we, as the city planning and designing professionals, need to be able to respond to that and to try to create places that have a lower carbon footprint and that are livable places with a dignity and a quality of life for the people that represent the growth of those cities. So that's, and I think that there is a lot of potential in cities to reduce the global carbon footprint, because cities are where it's all the carbon's being created. And so therefore it's where the most potential to reduce it lies. And I think that's the challenge before us.
That said, prove me wrong, right? Please, that's not a view. And I'm sure that if you prove us wrong as a generation itself, that'll be most welcome. If you find out, sometimes orthodoxy also comes in from the podium, right? And then you try to be a rebel, but then you become the mainstream very quickly, right? So look at it as a conventional point of view. Look at yourself challenging the conventional and looking at alternatives, and that's the best way to do things.
Yeah, myself Parag. Just a thought. There is always a scarcity of funds in the rural areas for water management and all these things. And when we see that sewage, when we flows from the rivers, in 100 and 150 kilometers, it get pure, not only up to the drinking purpose, but at some extent it is usable. So will it be possible to use the STP funds in the rural areas so that the upper areas of the cities or dams or rivers can get treated as a micro watershed development, and ultimately the migration from the rural areas to urban areas can be reduced. Ultimately it will reduce the burden on the cities, as well as the STP generation can be reduced. It is possible, is it?
No, absolutely. So when Bangalore transports its wastewater to the tanks, it's seen as a lift irrigation scheme. It's not a water transfer scheme, it's a lift irrigation scheme, right? And it's lift irrigation with fertilizer, so lift fertigation scheme. That's the way you have to imagine it. And the investments are coming from the minor irrigation department. So these are the new imaginations we need, as you rightly pointed out. Already farmers invest in transporting untreated wastewater from the rivers flowing out of Bangalore to 22 kilometers. Farmers invest monies to ship the water, untreated wastewater, and use it for agriculture purpose, right? So, and not one or two farmers. I'm talking about 5,000 to 10,000 farmers who are doing this, right? So people realize the value of what resources at what particular point of time and are willing to put the money where their mouth is. So we need to figure out ways by which we work in partnership with them so that we reduce the health risk, we reduce the environmental risk. That's the way to look at it at all times, scientifically. I'm sort of amazed that no youngster is asking a question. Is it that we are so overwhelming, or what is it that is not exciting enough, or what is it, you're too shy, or?
Come on, somebody here. Who's here?
I also want to know, what have we missed? Have we missed some huge challenge of climate change that we haven't talked about? I'm interested in your views of what the big challenges are here and what you see as the hope for creating, more resilient cities. But if you had another question, please ask that.
So earlier today in the morning, we had a session with Prasanna Desai sir. So he was addressing that after COVID, the trend of remote working has, it's come in front of us. It's come into the light. So with this remote working environment, we will be able to reduce the like urbanization can be reduced. So is it like, what is your opinion on it? Like,
I have an opinion, but I have it on everything. But this was the promise of the 90s when the first computer came in, and when the internet started to come, then they told us in our urban planning classes and schools, hey, you know what? This is, you work from home, no need for any city. The city is connected through wires and Wi-Fi, and you don't have to come. Now, just yesterday, Wipro insists that workers have to come back to their office and at least work for 3 days a week. They want people in their offices. With some of the leading IT companies, I don't see this utopia which should happen, but it's not happening because companies want people back into their office. They think people are slacking, that productivity is not good enough, or the definition of efficiency is not being reached, or something of that sort, right? So I don't know. I wish that it becomes true, but I don't think it will become true.
so maybe the companies are asking them to come back because they have that infrastructure. They have already invested in that infrastructure. So, like, if we stop investing in that infrastructure later, if we can achieve that, we have better Wi-Fi's everywhere. So, can that be the future? Like,
We actually have companies in the Bay Area. It's a huge tech economy there, and we have companies that have now allowed pretty much indefinite work from home policy, and they've realized that they don't have to do that additional increment of growth of their campus that maybe they had in the master plan, because they don't need that 30% additional office space. So I think some of that is happening. I also believe that the pendulum swings. And I think that the work from home pendulum swung, way to one side during COVID. I think it's going to swing back. I don't think it'll swing all the way where we were, because I think we've learned something as a society from COVID, that it is possible to do a lot, to have a lot more flexibility in our in our sort of our work-life balance, and there are ways to work remotely. But I think I think a lot of companies, and I think it's certainly true in the creative industries, really benefit from people being together to develop ideas. It's really hard to do that in a work from home situation. On a video screen, there's a certain amount you can do, but there's some collaborative energy that comes together when people are together. I think people are also social animals, and I think people want to have that experience with other people in the workplace, and we're hearing that, also in sort of our circle. So I think we're going to settle in somewhere, but I don't see this sort of radical shift to all of a sudden we don't need offices anymore and everybody's working from home.
That said, Biome Trust, we don't have an office and we work from home. And I think that most of the people who work with me don't work from home. They have fun from home. But that's the boss talking. But I think new institutions will not necessarily be in the software sector, but in other sectors, which will start to do things very differently from it. And our conversations are on WhatsApp. There's some good that WhatsApp can do. So some of the creative conversations and the photographs are on WhatsApp, so that's also possible.
Good evening, sir.
The student has to stand up and ask questions always. Yeah.
Sir, as you said, Karnataka state government says Chikballapura and Kolar is a drought district. Like as you said, Bangalore wastewater is supplying to these two districts. Then what is the use of ethanol project? Like they are spending 22,000 crores for it, as well as there is a main river called Papagni also flows through two districts. Then what is the use of this ethanol project, and what is your insights on that?
That's a money-making project. It's cost 22,000 crores. It will cost another crores. Not a drop of water has come of the promised water, which should have come 4 years back. So that's the thing of it all, right? So you'll have good projects and you'll have crazy infrastructure projects like that also running at the same time. What's the use? There's no use. But there's no use for the farmer or those who depend on water. There's a use for contractors. There's a use for engineers. There's a use for politicians. So that's the way things go. No? Not all things are good. I don't know whether I answered you completely or not. But the transfer of treated wastewater will also not fill all the tanks and lakes of Chikbalapur and Karnataka, because there's a limit to what the water available from Bangalore is. So there'll be a lot of lakes which will need to be worked on rainwater harvesting and collection of rainwater. There'll have to be lakes which will have to be filled from the diversion of west flowing rivers, and the Papagni River itself will have to be rejuvenated too. All of those will have to happen simultaneously.
Good evening. I'm sorry, I'm not young enough anymore. You're expecting some young people. My name is Dwight Pine. I'm an architect and urban designer. This is not specific to urbanization or water problems necessarily, but back to that word of urban resilience. So this question is for James, actually. We see, I mean, just through some of these two examples that both of you actually presented, that some of the problems that we face, that shock and awe, that actual change that comes, is really affecting every person in, let's say, what's in your city of Bangalore. You know, let's say from the politicians, the bureaucrats, to the actual person who's digging a well, to the farmer. And so, I mean, there's a huge, you said that this could be made possible just by the fact that all the changes actually impacted every single person of the city. Now, urban resilience is a big word, and it's coined and it has definitions. In the US, James, you've been traveling and you've been using the sabbatical so wisely to visit various continents. Are you actually seeing that all this change, these issues of climate change, economic change, are they really impacting the people of, let's say, in San Francisco, or are they really impacting the people in the US? Or is it something that, you know, that the intellectuals, the policymakers and the technocrats are really just worrying about, but, you know, all the people living in their homes are just cushiony, hunky-dory in their, you know, the American way?
I think we are feeling impact, and you know, the housing crisis that we have was actually not caused by climate change. It was caused by NIMBYism, and it was caused by the, you know, cost of land and cost of construction. But I think it, you know, is exacerbating a community's resiliency, or their lack of resiliency. If people aren't housed, you know, they're not working from a stable foundation. So if they have an impact of some kind, whether it's a big storm event or a little economic down cycle, or wildland fires, which are now becoming a huge issue in California, you know, they're that much less prepared. So I think we are having a lot of communities now that are being affected in a very real way by climate change. But we don't know exactly where that impact is going to come from. Some of it we can predict and we can plan for, you know, like sea level rise, because it's sort of this incremental thing that's happening over time. But big storm events, you know, that come out of nowhere, it's hard to predict. Wildfires, we don't know where they're going to hit, and they've affected certain communities in a very real way. You know, they've destroyed thousands of homes, and that's exacerbating our, you know, our housing supply issue. Heat is a big factor in the American West, and we're certainly seeing that in California. And I think that's something that is affecting people's lifestyles. So, yes, I would say that, you know, we are feeling it, you know, certainly some communities more than others. I think vulnerable populations, you know, populations that are lower on the socioeconomic ladder in the U.S. are certainly feeling it. You know, they're, homes are getting flooded more frequently. They might be on the part of the wildfire impact is that a lot of people have moved out of the city centers because of the cost of living, and they've moved out into the wilder lands just to be able to afford a home. But that has now put them at risk because they're in the path of these wildfires. So, a lot of people that have moved to have a more affordable way of life are now impacted because they're in these vulnerable areas to the spread of fire.
So they are getting impacted, and by all these examples that you say. But when you're doing these large projects, and there's of course large amount of public participation process that also gets into making these master plans. Are those people, the people who've actually moved out in a probable path of a wildfire, are they actually realizing that this is because of climate change, or are they just seeing it as one other phenomenon? I mean, are they talking about coastal rise? Are they talking about climate change? Are they talking about wildfires and heat sort of things? Or are they just cribbing about the fact that, house rent is too high, or, something like that? Are they able to understand what's causing them? That's actually probably my fundamental question.
I don't know that there's a yes or no to that. I think it's an uneven picture. Some people are just trying to survive. They're just trying to pay their next rent bill. They're trying to keep a steady job. They're trying to find daycare for their kids. And maybe aren't associating those concerns with climate change. I think in other instances, there's sort of very direct, obvious things that people do see the risk and they do see the connection to climate change. So I think it really depends on the place. It depends on, what people are feeling in that particular community. One of the things that I think was, sort of really clearly articulated in my discussions in Australia. I met with a group in Sydney that it was a gathering of 20 people from local, state, and sort of metropolitan government, but also nonprofits that are sort of working on the resiliency issue. And the notion that resilience is a very specific place-based undertaking for any community. There aren't sort of these broad brush definitions of this is what resiliency means and this is going to apply to every community. Every community is feeling something that's very specific to their community, brought about by their socioeconomic makeup. It's brought about by their geography, maybe their exposure to certain natural forces that another community doesn't feel in the same way. And so the response to prepare those communities, each one, is very tailored to that community. And that's where the engagement process becomes so important, because when you create a plan, it can't be sort of a broad brush plan, but it has to be very localized to each community's situation. And so not sort of underfunding that engagement process was one of the points that was really made very strongly there.
Larger political connotations in what you say, because there's a huge element of hypocrisy in this whole thing, because they had a president who was a climate change denier who didn't sign the Paris Agreement, and I think about half of the US population does not believe that climate change is human-made, right? So that's there, on the one hand. On the other hand, those who have accepted climate change. Now, here in the Indian context, when one works with farmers and agriculturalists, these are people who are the least responsible for climate change. These are the people who are most impacted by those who overconsumed the carbon space and then left what the world is right now, 1.5 degrees Celsius height. Now, if we talk to them about mitigation, it's a huge disservice because they haven't even claimed their carbon space or carbon emission, right? So I believe that in India, in the context that we should work very hard on climate justice. That is to work with the most vulnerable, to adapt to what they have not done, right? To help them adapt to it. So our monies and our infrastructure fund for climate change should be more directed towards adaptation than mitigation. I think we still have enough carbon space to claim, and we should not worry too much about emissions as much as we should worry about quick adaptation of the most vulnerable. Otherwise, there's no time left for them, right? So that's the broader political context in which we have to think about and work on.
Hello. Hello, I'm Jayant. I just had one question. It's my concern. Urbanization actually is a reason of climate change, and basically we are destroying the nature by buying nature. So we spend a lot to maintain the nature, and that's what we are doing, and that's what the concern is. Means, isn't there a limit for the growth of urbanization? Means, like, there is no control to it, and the cities are growing like anything. And yeah, you just answered it, but is the thing which my concern was.
That's the Bhasmasura principle, right? So it's like a beast unleashed, which is going around because it has the powers to destroy, going around everywhere. And we have to make sure that Bhasmasura puts his hand on his own head. That is our big challenge in the world, right? But you're absolutely right. You captured it the way we have marketed it or converted it into a product, the environment and climate, and we want to consume it, and we think we can buy ourselves out of trouble at the same time while we destroy it. So you're there.
I agree with what he said.
Bhasmasura also?
I want to come back to a point that Vishwanath mentioned before, which is this issue of adaptation versus mitigation. And I think one of the toughest arguments that we can make is an argument for the mitigation side of the equation, because people don't understand the connection between, you know, the fossil fuel that they're burning in their car and, you know, the impact that we're all feeling in the globe right now. And there's no motivation to stop using that car, especially in societies which are starting to, you know, realize the dream of the middle class, and they're able to have disposable income and enjoy those things that come with it. To say, well, you can't use your car and you can't burn fossil fuel is a very tough argument, and it's really difficult to make the connection to what we're all feeling as a globe. What people do relate to is the adaptation strategies, as you said. Because they see the evidence of it, and so they understand that because of what I saw happen in that last storm, we need to adapt the way we're living, put the protective measures in place and all of that. So that's a much easier direct connection to make. I believe that both are extremely important. It's just that it's the job of different players to make sure that we're working on both of that. So I do think that the mitigation side of the equation needs to happen. It needs to be the, sort of the overseeing bodies of national governments and United Nations and organizations like that are making sure that we're meeting the targets we need to, that those need to be sort of top-down policy making. And then the adaptation side is just something that we have to keep working on because we must.
Prasanna, do you want to say something?
So I think it was very interesting to see these two viewpoints and though they are exactly similar. But what I want to really respond to is what Vishwanath has been doing. This is complete bottom-up approach. It is the bottom-up approach that needs, and I'm sure that is what you are doing with your community in US also. So this is what needs to be strengthened. There is no other way out. It's the people who are at the fulcrum. And until unless we get people on board, and this is for all of us as professionals, because you mentioned that architects and landscape architects, urban designers, all are very busy. Now that is where the whole thing really lies, Where do we want to be? Do we want to get into projects, or do we want to solve the problem? As you rightly said. So I think it is the problem which needs to be solved. And that is what needs to be identified. And there has to be some structure where the youngsters, and there are many youngsters, let me tell you, in our profession, which are now into the system and trying to do something, and not necessarily taking the same path of what I say, going beyond the boundary rather than within the boundary. You are within a plot, within a campus or something. Now to this, whether it can be institutionalized is the question. And for me, when I look at COVID also, and the way the government or the systems today work, the government has given up that this is not our role. And they are declared like this, that everything that city needs to be in the private realm. So what is the government really doing? I think somewhere this policy needs to change. And we must have the trust and the faith, and the government themselves have their trust and the faith in the system to create systems where all the professionals can come on board, rather than you are doing it individually, but how does it expand unless you have a system in place. COVID taught us and showed us that the government hospital did work, and it's the government hospital which provided everything. So it is the faith in the system. It is no more happening in planning. It is no more happening in buildings. It is everything is told out into consultancy. And I think that is what needs. And the city needs to be finally governed by the system, as you say, rightly, the politician and the bureaucracy, and then the engineers. So how do we strengthen that is the key. And I don't know, I would like to know from you, were you able to strengthen this? And Korea said that cities are the engines of growth. And that is the engines of growth. Everybody will come there because you have to survive, and you have the facilities, and that's the attraction. So that will remain. This COVID thing which will happen, there may be 10% which may matter, but students, people will still come, and this online thing no more is working, For other day also I had a talk online talk. I said stop doing online talks now, because you don't come to know even the reaction of the people, whether they are really listening to you or you are giving a passionate talk on this. What you were talking, both of you, passionately in front of us, and that's what really works. So the 2 years is over, and I hope this will continue, and it will be direct. 10% change will always happen. It always was a remote at times where you could do with WhatsApp, mobile or something. Something will remain. Work from home will also remain, which is there. You can have a small units which are working from home. Computer is there, but it cannot be eliminated. So how do we can get the systems strengthened in India? And do we have the systems in place where people are part of the system rather than outside the system? And always a activism like this by NGOs and this, they are the ones which are really trying to do it bottom-up approach.
No. So one of the things is I sit with the BWSSB, the water utility. I'm part of the technical approval committee. So the challenge is that as an NGO, you can't be outside and continue. You can be a maverick for some time. You can get your kicks in life. You can be idolized or whatever, and then that's it. आप जाओगे तो सब खत्म हो जाएगा आपके साथ वो. That's one thing. But then the challenge for us is we know the system now. There's no excuse to say, oh, we don't know the system, or to simply blame the system. How do we change the system? How do we make sure that it gets embedded in the system? And that's the challenge before youngsters, right? And for that, you'll also have to be part of the system. You will have to be outside the system. You'll have to be part of the system. You'll have to work with the system. You'll have to try and change the system and make sure that the change is long-term sustainable. And I think it can be done. It's not, as Elinor Ostrom says, we create institutions, we can change institutions. We'll have to figure out the way of changing institutions, and that's the way to go ahead. If necessary, create a political party if you want to, and then become the political player that you have to be to change the system. That's the way to go. Yeah, but those are all sort of really long-term words, and I'm just...
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that, governance is multi-layered, so we need to have the players at all levels in order to bring things to fruition. So I think, grassroots efforts are part of it, but we also have to have those champions in the political structure. One of the things that I was really impressed with in the Mumbai Climate Action Plan, which is just newly released, it's a really terrific plan, is that they've sort of identified all of the key strategies that need to happen to, to take the proper actions. And then they've gone and identified where those advocates and trained people need to be placed in all of the different agencies of government to make sure that those, those champions are there to actually implement the policies. So it's not a plan that just says, here are the policies, good luck, and then the plan sits on a shelf, but it says, here's the structure of people placed in all the right places to make sure that this plan, starts to take action, gain momentum, and then starts to have its impact. So I think just paying attention to governance structure, that all the players are there at each level, they're all working together, is really important.
I think on that note, we'll call it a night. And I think this was a wonderful, thoughtful Q&A. And of course, the presentations, I was still trying to absorb a lot of what was shared and a lot of thoughts going through my mind. And I'm sure with the audience as well. So thank you, Jim, for coming. Thank you for spending. I think this has catalyzed, I know in me, so many thoughts and so many things that I hope that we can continue working on things like this. And I'm appreciative that you left your practice, your family, your country, and spent time with us here, learning from us. That's very gracious, and I'm grateful for you doing that and inspiring in us the sense of learning. And I think I'm looking forward to taking this on in a little bit and together. So thank you. And Vishwanath, thank you for the work you do, for sharing that with us today. I know you took time out from your daily busy life, solving the problems of the world and being with us today, so thank you for that. I also want to thank Hemant here. Hemant, will you please stand up? So Hemant is a dear friend. He's always smiling. He's always sketching on the weekends, and he is the architect of this space. And we have now used this space many, many times, and this is the first time I'm seeing Hemant here, so I'm taking the opportunity to thank him. And we are very grateful for the city, and I am personally very grateful for this space so that we can get to use it and we can have events like this and enjoy it. So thank you, Hemant. And thanks to all of you for staying, for the Q&A and for listening. Tomorrow we have 3 more talks. We have Prasanna speaking tomorrow. We have Dvaipayan speaking tomorrow, and we've got Ganesh who's coming in from Ahmedabad to speak to us. So we've got 3. I hope all of you all can come tomorrow, and we see you again. Thank you.